your Miata. If you've been in the tuning business long enough, if you've been modifying cars long enough, you've probably gone a little bit too far down the road and basically rendered a car unusable. I mean, heck, we've all been there. So we're going to talk today about maybe how to avoid that, things to keep in mind, some suggestions. This isn't necessarily going to be a here's the perfect tire size to run on every single Miata sort of conversation, but I'm going to talk about some of the trade-offs you might get from doing those various things. Now, don't forget on our channel here that we have lots of videos on all sorts of topics. We do deep dives into things in terms of unsprung weight and bracing and brakes and more brakes. I see them talk about brakes a lot, and aerodynamics. So if you like that kind of thing, be sure to subscribe to our channel, like it, tell your friends about it, and throw any questions you might have in the comments. We make these videos for you to help you learn things about our favorite cars, and your feedback is always helpful. So during this comment, if you do have, or during this shoot, if you do have questions, please do throw them in the comments. I will answer them live in the comments if I can, or one of my coworkers will answer them for you. And if you're watching this in the future, go ahead and throw the questions in the comments. We'll do our best to help you there as well. If you do have specific questions about how do I, I have this thing I want to do with my car, what tire size should I use? The best way to get that answer is to contact our customer service department. Either give us a call or send us an email. That way we'll be able to help you more directly. It's a little more awkward to do in YouTube comments. So there you go. So yeah, that's what I was going to talk about. So like I said, anybody who's been into modifying cars for a while has maybe gone a little too far down the modification rabbit hole. We all think we want a race car for the street, but it turns out that sometimes you go a little too far towards race car, you end up with not so much street anymore. So we've got some examples here. I've got 4 cars with me here today that are all sort of at different points along the continuum of race car to street car. Some of them they're all streetable, they're all drivable. They all got here under their own power today. Some of them are ones you might want to jump into and drive across the country today. Some of them are ones you may not want to jump into and drive across the country today. All of them are capable sports cars, but let's talk about the different things about them and sort of what their limiting factors are. And this one in particular is an example of an actual dedicated race car that was built for rally, turned into a track, basically a track-only car, and has been turned back into a street car. So this is literally a race car for the street. And it shows off quite a few of the compromises that might be involved in something like that, and maybe why you might not want to do it to your own street car. So I'm going to cover this sort of piece by piece or area by area based on some of the questions and comments you folks have put in before when we announced we're going to have this video. So I'm going to start with wheels and tires because, of course, that's the one thing we all love to do. We love great-looking wheels. We love great big fat tires. They look awesome. It's a great way to improve cornering and braking and acceleration pretty much immediately. They look fantastic, which is the main reason. But they have effect. So, I mean, these cars are all on fairly aggressive tires because that's the sort of life we lead around here. But they don't all, they all have different sort of capabilities. We don't run them all on slicks on the street. And over here is a couple of spare sets of rubber that are used for this car, actually. As you can see, this is a street legal tire. That's a Toyo RR. Nice and sticky. It's, it can be driven on the street. The nice thing about the RR is it doesn't tend to heat cycle out as badly as a lot of other, so we call them semi-slicks, R compound tires like this. But it's going to come with some compromises. And then we have beside it, this is an all-season. It's a good all-season, Pilot Sport, all-season 4. But it's not going to have the same level of grip on this one. So you have to remember when you're looking at tires, aggressive tires like this one are huge amounts of fun for the track. But the problem on the street is that if you go super fat, you start getting weird effects in the steering sometimes. You start getting tram lining, which is where the car starts to follow the low points in the road. If you live in an area that has a lot of truck traffic, and you've got those grooves in the road where the trucks like to live, the car will follow those very aggressively with fat tires. Same if you run a lot of offset as well. If you really push or very low offset, if you really push the wheel out, it's going to increase your ability or your tendency to tram line. And that can have a big effect if you're trying to drive the car for a long distance. It's always darting around. It's always trying to follow the road. You're also going to find that your steering feel changes as you run a bigger, fatter, tire with no tread on it at all versus one that has tread. the weight's going to be felt through the wheel as well. You're going to feel the car might just be a little bit heavier on its feet. It just, you ever run around and you don't land on your feet right, and you kind of slap your foot down, and it's a little flat-footed when you're running? It kind of feels a little bit like that if you run a little bit too much tire on a street car. You know, you get the feeling that the tires are maybe just kind of flopping around a lot more than they should be. And that's a downside to running something super aggressive like this. I mean, this is the track car for the street. It's a plausible option. When I'm driving the Targa Miata, the striped one, to the track, this is what I drive it there on. But it's not as happy as it could be, and I definitely don't want to do it in standing water. Do we have any questions over there, guys, yet? Oh, yeah. I'm only going to be talking about wheels and tires yet. I will get to the rest of it in a moment.
Got some suspension stuff. Otherwise, nothing necessarily wheels and tires yet.
Okay. So one thing you'll find if you do drive a car on the street and you're looking for maximum driving enjoyment, you might not want to put on huge sticky tires. You might not want to just staple it to the ground because it takes away your ability to play with it in quite the same way. One of the cars in my personal collection that you've seen on this channel is an almost stock 1990 Miata, and it's on a set of, they're Michelins, they're 185 6014s, they're a 340 tread wear, so they're an okay tire, but they're not a super sticky tire, and it's really fun to drive on the street because it's nimble. It's got the nice lightweight wheel and tire setup, but it also lets me play with it at speeds where I'm not going to die if I make a mistake. I can play with slip angles on the street without being, while still being a responsible citizen. I can't say the same thing about the Targa car. That one will love to go around corners as fast as possible, but it means it's not as playful. And if you're looking for driver enjoyment just while you're driving around on back roads, maybe letting the car move around a little bit is the way to go. Not the race car choice, but it's a fun choice. Do you have a question?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Lots of wheels and tire stuff now.
We're not going to get into what is the perfect wheel-tire combination for your specific car in this conversation. I know you all want the answers to that. That's what our customer service team is for. More than a quarter of our company is dedicated to answering your questions. So please do contact our customer service folks. They will help you choose between a good wheel-tire setup for your setup in terms of width, in terms of diameter, that sort of thing.
Would you perhaps do like a very generalized basic, like width, offset, basic?
Okay, the question is, can I do a generalized basic width versus offset conversation? Offset is basically the distance between the center of the wheel, right there, and the mounting point, which is where it actually bolts to the hub. And the lower the offset, the more this moves in, or more importantly, the more the wheel moves out. People love putting on low offset wheels because it pushes the tire out. It looks fantastic. I mean, poke is a thing. It can have effects on the steering because of what it does to what's called the scrub radius of the suspension. Basically, you've got a point that your tire rotates around when it's going around corners, and the further away the actual wheel is from that geometric point, the more kickback you get through the steering, a little more feel, the more tramlining you get. So you do have to watch out when you're playing with offset. If you go too far out, it might look awesome, especially if you're running flared fenders, but it is going to have some definite effects on the steering. That's why we like to stay within a certain range of offset. You'll notice that Flyin Miata doesn't carry any zero offset or positive or negative offset wheels, and that's mostly because from a function standpoint, staying within a certain range works much better. In terms of width, Miatas came with everything from 185 to a 205 from the factory. Literally, that's as wide as they ever got. This is a 225, so this is about an inch wider than the widest factory tire. This thing's probably a 245. 235 in this one? Okay. That one's on there is on 245s. Those do have side effects in terms of, again, the tram lining gets worse. Grip goes up, which is always nice. But you do get more tram lining. You get a heavier sort of steering feel. Not heavier in terms of more effort or more information, but just, yeah, it does take a little more effort. It doesn't feel as nimble. So for a fun street car, I like to go a little bit skinnier. For a competition car, I will throw as much rubber as I can underneath it and still keep it functioning. Hopefully that was a start. And again, we do have other videos on this channel about tires, about wheels, well, about wheels mostly, about offset and that sort of thing. So the other big one is suspension. Suspension is an area of the car where you can make the biggest difference for the least amount of money, which also means you can ruin your car for cheap if you do it wrong or if you make the wrong choices. And you notice that all of these cars are sitting, none of them are slammed. Ruined. None of these cars are slammed. The reason for that is because in order for your suspension to work, it's got to have room to move. And so if you are going to drop the car as far as it goes, you're probably going to end up on the bump stops all the time, or most of the time, which leads to very, very rough ride quality. But rough ride quality also means your tires are having trouble staying on the ground, so you're actually going to be decreasing your amount of grip as well. So it looks awesome, but it may end up putting you in a place where you just don't enjoy driving the car as much. I was evaluating a set of inexpensive coilovers a while back, and I put them on the car to test them out. I knew what I was doing. It was only a short period of time. Tried to set them up as best I could. The car was not any fun to drive, and it got to the point where I just didn't want to drive it anymore, to the point where I actually left it at the shop here one time and took home a development car because I could not bear to drive my car 20 miles home that day. So you do have to be very careful when you are setting up for suspension. There's two extremes. One, you can go super cheap and just drop it down low and say, well, I don't care, you know, I don't mind a bad ride, until you discover that you just don't want to drive your car as much anymore because it's just not comfortable. The other end is you decide to put on a race-bred suspension, something with a lot of cred that gets a lot of plaudits for its race handling, and then you discover that racetracks are not the street, and all of a sudden your ride quality again goes down. You're getting beaten around because of aggressive spring rates. Even with great damping, you will notice it. And again, this sort of thing was like, well, I have to go to the store. Should I take the fun Miata or should I take a boring car? Assuming you have all options, then you might choose to take the boring car, and then what's the point of having a fun Miata in the first place? So this guy here, I mean, legit race car. It's still on the same suspension that I ran it on when it was a dedicated track car. Most of the time. It was used for suspension testing, so not always the same. So it is not as comfortable to drive around as these other ones. And because of that, and because of a few other aspects, it doesn't get taken out for fun drives anymore. For me, I'm okay with that because I do have a mostly stock Miata that is great for just going out for no consequence, let's go play in the sun on the twisty road kind of drive. I'm lucky that way. It's a occupational hazard, but it has taken away the ability of this car to just be, I'm going to go take this one out and have some fun. Fantastic suspension for a good time. Of course, it's running our Fox suspension with upgraded spring rates on it. Fantastic suspension for fun, but it doesn't swallow up the road in quite the same way that something with a little more ride height, a little more travel, and a lighter spring rate does. So this is a conscious decision, but this is the downside to the whole racetrack or race car for the track thing. I also have to watch out for ground clearance because it does sit a little bit lower. There's a skid plate underneath here that gets dragged. I can't even run the aerodynamics from the front on the street because I don't think I could get it out my driveway. Yeah, compromises. I mean, this is the sort of thing you got to watch for. Meanwhile, cars like this one sits a little bit higher. It's not that much. It's maybe, I haven't measured them, it might only be a ½ inch higher. But it's enough that it's got that much more travel. It's got more importantly, it's got softer spring rates. Good quality dampers. This is running our Flyin Miata Stage 2 suspension on it with the Koni shocks. 2.5 actually in this one. But it's designed to be more compliant at the expense of maybe a little bit of aggressiveness on the track. This is still a trackable car, but it's a softer feel. It's not as aggressive. I'm not going to win the track day in this car, but I'll probably have more fun on the drive home. Again, over these two, we've got a similar sort of thing. This one, if I remember correctly, is sitting on our Flyin Miata Stage 2. So again, Koni shocks, Flyin Miata springs. This one's running on the Fox suspension, once again. This is running our default spring rates. It's a little less aggressive. And this is a car that you can jump into and drive across the country. We have done this. We've driven this car out to the Gap, for example, which is 3,600-mile round trip. And it's a comfortable, great road tripper. Because we have the race-bred suspension, but it's not set up purely for the track. We could have gone stiffer on the springs. We could have gone lower on the ride height. But we backed off a little bit to keep it very streetable. This one, of course, is a 100% daily driver-capable car with a relatively inexpensive suspension system on it. But it just plain works. And again, this is a good all-rounder. Not going to win the track day, but you'll enjoy the drive to and from more. So this is the sort of thing you got to watch for when you're looking at how you want to use the car, and be honest with yourself as to whether you really want a track car driving around the street, because it's fun when you're younger, been there, but so you start learning that really you're making compromises you don't need to. Now, one question we get a lot is coilovers versus shocks and springs. I did a whole video on that. Coilover doesn't mean anything. It just means you can adjust your ride height as opposed to using the ride height that was chosen for you by the spring designer. One of these cars is on coilovers, one of them is not. Can't tell from looking at it. So coilovers versus springs and shocks, whole other conversation, and it doesn't say anything about quality of the damping, the choice of spring rates, even the ride height is not implied at all by the word coilover. So the one thing you do have to watch out for coilovers is a lot of really cheap and nasty ones out there. You might want to stay away from those. Do we have anything else there, Mike?
Yeah, you want to talk about some aero?
Aero?
How much aero is too much for a street car?
How much aero is too much for a street car? Well, if it gets to the point where you can't get out of your own driveway anymore because your splitter will mow the lawn, which is this situation, that is too much. Really, aero is unlikely to be a problem unless it affects the ability of the car to live in the real world. We have a diffuser that we're testing right now on another platform that hangs a fair way back the back bumper. We want to make sure that it doesn't affect the departure angle too much. It doesn't prevent you from leaving your driveway and going onto the street without dragging it. That obviously would affect the streetability of a car with not a lot of benefit. We've had diffusers on that ND on the end there, the Veris diffuser. It does not affect things like departure angle dramatically, and it works great on the street. And again, this is a street car that has been all over the place, even with the big wing on it. The biggest disadvantage to running a big wing on the street is other drivers. They will take it as a statement. They may take it as an insult to their particular masculinity or femininity. We don't judge. But it can lead to problems with pickup trucks, for example. But it doesn't really have a lot of downside. Looks a little out of place perhaps in the street, but hey, whatever works. These louvers, for example, also don't really have a lot of downside on the street either, even though you can see right into the engine bay. The engine bay is waterproof to a certain extent. I forget the actual specification given by Mazda, but as long as you're not pouring water directly into the spark plug wells, this is not really something you need to worry about. So there's not a lot of downside to aero on the street, other than it can be fragile. You don't really want to bump some of this stuff. You don't want a big splitter. I mean, Travis here is probably pretty careful when he's pulling into a parking space, I expect. Because you don't really want to bump that beautiful it's a carbon Miata splitter, isn't it? Yeah. And tear that thing up. But generally speaking, not much of a downside. I like polyurethane front aero because you can bump this off all the curbs you want to. It doesn't care. It's flexible. It was more flexible until I put my under tray on this again a couple of days ago. But these can flex and bounce back again without having to worry about anything. Okay, weight savings. This is a fun one because it's the least expensive way to increase your Miata's performance, really. Weight savings doesn't cost you anything up to a certain point. Let's have a look at this car. We'll go around this side, Travis. This is a race car interior that has been retrimmed for the street. Well, so you know it's a race car. It's got a helmet in the passenger seat. No carpet. The heating and ventilation has been removed. No sound system that you can see. There's a little something hidden back there, but the center console is completely taken away. It's got race seats. It's got harnesses. It's got a removable steering wheel. All of these choices affect what this car is like on the street. The bare metal interior is loud, which is fine. You know what you're doing. It's loud. It's rattly. Stones get in there. They rattle around on the floorboards all the time. That's what it is. The seats are not, actually they're bolted straight through to the floor in this car, so they're not adjustable, which is a problem if you have multiple size drivers. The harnesses are a bit of a pain in the butt if you're jumping into the car on a regular basis. They take a little longer to put on. They do restrict your ability to look over your shoulder, for example, to do shoulder checks when you're driving. There's a limit to how far you can move your head. They don't let you squirm around on road trips, for example. It's louder. It doesn't have a heater. It doesn't have a window defroster. It doesn't really have a stereo to speak of. It's got something I can play music. I can sort of hear the beat, but that's about the extent of it. Might as well put a Bluetooth speaker behind the seats, honestly. So this is a very compromised interior. Yes, you can drive it around. I have driven this thing from Laguna Seca to Grand Junction, which is a 1,000-mile trip, in November, over Donner Pass in the snow. This was because another car that was with us at Laguna Seca broke, and we needed the trailer, so I had to drive this one home. So it can be done, but I was wearing earplugs because of the amount of noise in it, and it was so loud that when the header actually came apart, I didn't notice until I pulled into a gas station and took my earplugs out. So it's not really, this is a sort of compromise that, yes, I saved a lot of weight by what I've done to the interior of this car, but it has really affected, it really compromised the drivability. So the streetability. You definitely want to take this into account if you are thinking of, I'm going to save a bunch of weight by stripping out the interior. I mean, in this case, I even replaced the rear window on the hardtop with Lexan because it saved me about 6 pounds. But it also means that I can't really clean it all that well because I don't want to scratch the Lexan, and also it will, if it was parked outside, it will discolor over time. So, I mean, everything's got compromises. This does make it a little bit harder to care for. There's other ways to save weight, of course. You can throw carbon fiber parts at the car, which is a very expensive way to save weight. And don't necessarily see it, and it won't save a lot of weight, but I mean, it looks great. Not a big downside there. Things like carbon fiber hoods will save a couple of pounds, but again, they have problems with durability, so you might not want to consider that. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do any of these things. I'm just saying that these are the sort of things that over time will lead to you enjoying your car less if you're not careful. You've got to make sure you're doing what you're doing for the right reasons and with full knowledge of what you're doing. I don't want anybody to, go and get a car and strip it out of the way and lower it down and put on a super loud exhaust system and then discover they haven't driven the car in 6 months because it's just so loud and so low and, whatever. When my wife and I decided we want to go over to Fruto, which is 15 miles from our house, because there's a great pizza place there, hot tomato pizza, we don't take this car. We take my mostly stock Miata because that's the one that's fun to just jump in and go scooting down the road. So this thing has been pulled so far in the race car direction that it's really not the car we choose to drive on the street. Mike, do we have questions?
Oh boy, do we.
Oh boy, do we have questions. Oh, I mean, his fingers are bleeding over there trying to type answers.
Do you want to go back to suspension at all?
Let's go back to suspension if there's a good question, Mike.
Sure. You were talking about ride quality and, yada, yada.
Yeah.
What if you had more adjustable suspension, like 2-way, 3-way, 4-way, whatever adjustable suspension?
Does more adjustable suspension mean better ride quality? Is that really the question, Mike, do you think?
Sure.
Maybe.
Or can you make it more dual duty and not ruin your street car?
Can you make it more dual duty? Basically, can you throw money at the suspension and end up with a suspension that works everywhere? I think that's fundamentally the question. To some extent, yes. The Fox Racing suspension that's on this thing is far more comfortable, far more effective on the street than another suspension with the same spring rates might be, because it's got a lot more travel than a lot of other suspensions, and because it's got the quality of damping it does. That helps. I can also, crank it up when I'm on the track if I want to, and back it off on the street. Get rid of some of those. I'm not going to get in the technical part of this one, but basically, change that one part of the shock dyno curve. So yes, you can with multi-adjustable adjustments. To some extent, you can help a lot, and with quality of damping by having really good dampers, that can help a lot too. Running a poorly made, poorly valved, cheap damper with a lot of spring rate is not necessarily going to be a comfortable thing, but you can get away with more with really good damping quality. It's never going to be as comfortable. And if you lower the car too far, I mean, this one does sit lower and it runs higher spring rates in large part because of that, and that takes away my ability to absorb certain kinds of bumps, especially big ones. And that's not something you can get around with adjustments. So you do want to look for a suspension that gives you as much wheel travel as you can get, both in droop and compression, because droop comes in when you're going over crests. That's a real world thing. You go over a set of railway tracks in a hurry, and the car gets right up on its toes. If you don't have enough droop travel, things might get a little hairy at that point because you're not really putting any weight on the wheels. It's going to be a little squirrely when you land. I once had quite a moment going over a set of railway tracks as a young man and not enough rear suspension travel. Things got a little bouncy there for a while, but pulled through. This car has enough suspension that I have actually gone over a speed bump during a closed time stage at 80 miles an hour, and the only way you can tell in the video is this enormous bang sound, but the car never twitched. So yeah, good suspension can let you get away with a lot, but it's not going to solve everything. All the adjustments in the world, if adjusted properly, will help, but not completely solve, completely turn it into a street pussycat. And if adjusted incorrectly, will only make it worse. So yes, no, maybe, yeah. So one of the questions we get about bracing, is bracing worthwhile? Is it something that's only for track cars? How much weight is too much on a street car? And I'm a firm believer in bracing for street cars because they allow the suspension to work better. They make the whole chassis stiffer, the whole structure stiffer. I've done a whole video on bracing, believe it or not. It's called When Flex is Bad. And we talk quite a bit about the effects of this, but basically the more rigid the platform your suspension is attached to, the better the suspension can work. It's isolated more. It allows it to do what it's designed to do and nothing else. So on a car like this one, for example, it's got our strong arms underneath here. It's got a butterfly brace underneath the bottom, none of which you can see. It's got a roll bar, which actually helps with body rigidity to some extent. I used to do this backwards. There you go. It's got one of our shock tower braces. We'll be talking about those in a little bit. But all this extra bracing does help. It makes the car more comfortable. It makes it more consistent in how it reacts to things. Competition cars might not want this because they may not want the extra weight that comes with it. Autocross cars in particular reward lightweight more than they reward chassis stiffness. So this is a place actually where you don't want to follow the race car guys because you want to make these as rigid as possible so the suspension can work well. And the race car guys might have things like full cages. This car is seam welded, for example. It used to run a full front cage as well as the back. So it was a very, very rigid chassis. It didn't need things like a butterfly brace because of all the extra stuff on it. But for street cars, bolt-on braces are fine. They're a good choice. I don't know why there's tape on this car, but now can you make a car too heavy with bracing? Not really. I mean, there's a limit to how much bracing you can really bolt on one of these things. And in terms of percentage of the car weight, it's not that big. You're going to start feeling it eventually. If you drove it back to back with one with absolutely no bracing and one with lots of bracing, you'll feel the difference in rigidity. You might feel a little bit difference in responsiveness, but I believe that the extra stiffness, the extra rigidity of the platform actually increases the responsiveness, so I think it's a good payoff on a street car. Now, if you're throwing 100 pounds of subwoofer in the trunk, that's going to have an effect on the way the car drives as well, but that's obviously not a race car for the street sort of option, and you knew that going in. All right, well, I kind of touched on this a little bit, the interior, the modifications you touched on the interior. This car, obviously, a long way down that particular road. These cars are not. This one's got a customized interior because this is as much a show car as a go car. So it's got a modified interior. You can see we've changed up. Pretty much everything you touch has been modified, and that's because that's the place where you really notice it. None of these things take away from drivability. They actually improve it because this one's got really nicely shaped seats. Again, we did a video on how to do a foamectomy on these actual seats a while back. So you can actually improve the comfort quite a bit. This steering wheel does take away from, it does not have an airbag anymore, so there's a potential safety downside to that, but it feels great in the hands. Your choice as to whether you would like to do that or not. But you can see it's possible to have a very nice interior. This is a very comfortable interior, but it's obviously not a track-based interior. This particular car is the least track-focused of the bunch that we have here, the least performance-focused, and the most sort of aesthetic and comfort-based of the bunch of them. The other two are running almost completely stock interiors. Steering wheel change, shift knob change. That's about the extent of it. But these are cars that do see, this one in particular has seen lots and lots of track use with the stock interior, and you can get away with that. It works just fine. This one, Travis is showing it off because it's his car. But this is another case where the places that you touch have been modified. This is one of our Cypher steering wheels, just feels that much better. And his shift knob, his transmission has not fallen down. That's actually a little short shift kit he's got going on there with little tiny shift knobs. So kind of looks like it's cold outside. Anyway, and then there's one other thing that is track-based that may or may not make your car a problem for the street, and that's these roll bars. Not so much in the ND. The ND and the NC, their roll bars sit well behind the seats. This is there's a little bit extra weight. It can, depending on how you install it, it can affect the way that the top latch is down. If you don't adjust that properly, it can make that difficult. But very few downsides to this on the street because of where they sit, where they do on these particular platforms. But the NA and the NB is a different story. The location of the roll hoop on an NA and NB is determined by the shape of the top. I mean, the roll bar has to fit under the top, and the top is not square. So the taller the roll bar is, the further forward it has to sit. The further back it is, the shorter it has to be to clear the top. So that means that you either have to have a short roll bar that's a long way back or a tall roll bar that's up close to your head. And that can be a problem. When you're on the track, you're strapped in, say with that target car behind you, you're fully restricted in place, you're wearing a helmet on the track. Even then you pad the roll bars just in case there's a strike, but the chances of you hitting that are quite low, especially again with the seats that are in there. You're down low, you're further forward, you're strapped in all sorts of places. Your head doesn't move that much. On a street car with a 3-point harness, there's a much better chance that you can actually hit your head on this. And one of our employees has done this, does not recommend the experience, and does not run a roll bar like this in his Street Miata for that reason. What's that?
2-inch scar.
He has a 2-inch scar on his head, and he swears it does not affect his. But you know, we're not going to judge that here. But yeah, that is definitely a potential compromise. Now, of course, the other side is if you go upside down, this is very much your friend. So at this point, you've got to decide what's more important to you: potentially being rear-ended, or getting in a situation where you have a rapid movement backwards of the driver, or an inversion. So this is definitely if you're going to run track days, you probably have to have a roll bar. But you want to make sure that it is not in a place where it's going to affect your head as you drive around. So this is very much a compromise sort of situation. You have to choose where you want to be on that compromise. Do we have any more questions, Mike?
Hey, can you talk about interior and what compromises would ruin a street car with like heat, NVH, noise, all that kind of stuff?
Okay. The question is, can I talk more about the interior and what compromises might affect heat and NVH? I think I might have actually covered this, but basically, let's go look back at the race car again. Specifically heat, yeah. So the carpet in a Miata is fairly thin. There's not a whole lot to it, but it does prevent heat transfer. It does insulate you a little bit. I'm going to scooch down here and talk through the car. One of the things that you feel with heat is basically the material that you're actually touching is how well it transfers heat. So if you touch hot metal, it's going to feel hotter than if you touch hot fabric. So if you have carpet on there, it's not going to feel quite as hot in the car as if you have bare metal. So bare metal does mean more heat in the cabin. You can see this is heat shielding all over the center console here. And even then I've got extra heat shielding on the inside, partly because this particular car with its power level throws a lot of heat down the transmission tunnel. But even without that, even with a normal 4-cylinder or turbo 4-cylinder, you've still got the potential for a lot of radiant heat into the cockpit. So that's not super comfortable. Like I said, they pick up stones, they throw stones around. They're always rattling around. You hit the brakes, but stones ride forward. It's amazing how many stones end up inside a car, especially if you're driving with the roof down. That's a bit of a downside. It doesn't make it as friendly a place. You know, if you were trying to attract a potential suitor into a car, showing up in a stripped out vehicle like this is not necessarily a big plus. And the lack of a heater, the lack of air conditioning, the lack of defrosting can actually be a real problem. I drove this car to work this morning. I think it was 36 degrees out. I had to make sure I wore a jacket. I'm going to be driving it home today. It's going to be in the 70s. I'm going to have the windows down. I'm glad I'm not doing this video in August when it would have been 105 degrees on the way home, because that would be an uncomfortable drive. Not just because of the heat, the radiant heat from in here, but also the fact I can't get rid of any of it. So that is definitely something you want to take into account. Years ago, I built a Lotus 7 replica, which is basically a 4-wheeled motorcycle. No heat, no sound deadening, anything like that. And the prep for it, I actually took the top and all the carpet out of my Street Miata and drove it around like that for a while. And including my entire HVAC system. I took out the heater, I took out the defroster, everything, just to see what it was like if I could live with it. And I did actually take my then girlfriend on a date on that one. We got a little cold on the way down the mountain, I gotta tell you. She still married me anyway, eventually. But I don't think it was because of that drive. I think it was despite of. Interestingly, she did actually buy a Miata shortly after that trip, so it couldn't have been all bad. So anyway, this is another fun race thing that can be a problem. Removable steering wheel. How race is that? That's cool. Problem is, if you park your car with the top down now, you have to remember to take the steering wheel off and put it in the trunk or something like that. Otherwise, you might not have a steering wheel when you come back to your car. So that's the sort of modification you don't realize when you put it on, that now you're going to have to care for your steering wheel as a separate entity from your car, which you never have to do before. Is that really what you're looking to do? Your car. Your choice, just make it with knowledge, with intent. Do we have anything else, Mike?
Can you talk about exhaust?
Can I talk about exhausts? I can certainly talk about exhausts. Or more specifically, mufflers. They're there for a reason. Yeah. There's not a huge amount of power to be unlocked by making your car louder. It's fun, and you can get a little bit of horsepower, but it's not enormous. It's not going to completely revolutionize the way the car works.
It is in the internet, though.
It is on the internet that they're faster. Yeah, it's true that loud cars are faster. Yes. I have story. I'm not going to tell some of those stories. But yeah, if you choose an exhaust that is particularly loud, or if it drones at a certain engine speed, which can be a problem with the NA and B especially, that is going to take away from your enjoyment of the car. Loud is fun most of the time. Loud is not fun all of the time. As I said, I had to drive this thing back from California wearing ear protection the entire way because of the amount of noise it makes. Because again, this thing was not built to be super quiet car. It's kind of fun when you get on it and it appears to be propelled mostly by decibels, but the downside of that is that you really don't want to drive it across the country because it's propelled mostly by decibels, and decibels get on top of you after a while. Now, of course, Flyin Miata does have an answer to that one for the ND, as we have our Hush-O-Matic exhaust, which is an actual active exhaust that opens and closes a butterfly that it makes it straight piped under certain conditions, and then closes it off to be nice and quiet in other conditions. Currently only available for the ND. It's the only active exhaust available for the Miata, but it is quite effective on that one. So there's a sales pitch for you. If you're an ND owner, we do have a best of all worlds exhaust available for you. And we are working on the earlier models as well. Just got to find a way to make it affordable. So we're working on it. So yes, too much noise fun, too much noise not necessarily fun. That little Lotus 7 I built made enormous amounts of noise. It blew fireballs out the exhaust. And chunks of muffler, I'm pretty sure, because it doesn't really have a muffler anymore. But it really did. It's not I drove it to Moab one time, which is 120 miles or something like that from our place. And yeah, at the end of the drive, you're just kind of like this the whole way, from the noise, from the wind, from the vibration. It was very much a race car for the street, and I was paying the price. Mike, more questions?
Yeah. How about aftermarket ECUs, tunes, flashes, all that kind of stuff?
Aftermarket ECUs and tunes and flashes and drivability. That's an important one, actually. Was that, Mike? And emissions. Yeah. Yeah, so aftermarket ECUs, not necessarily legal for emissions on a federal level, maybe not on a state level. Definitely check out that particular piece of information before you start digging around on your own car. You know, if you have a 96 or later car and your ECU does not return OBD2 codes and you have emissions testing, you likely have a problem. So that's a big thing to watch out for when you are looking at aftermarket ECUs. But one of the things that people don't tell you about aftermarket ECUs is how hard it is to tune the edges of the map. Full throttle's easy. Idle takes a little time, you can make it work. Cold start is a pain in the butt. All of the transitional stuff takes a while to get on top of. All of the edge cases where it's cold and you've got the AC on with the blower on all the way because the windows are fogged up, that sort of stuff is really hard and is not usually taken into account in internet forums when you're talking about aftermarket ECUs. So be aware that your aftermarket ECU might take away some of the drivability of your car, no matter how good the tuner says they are. It is a difficult thing. We did ECUs for years, 20 odd years of ECU tuning at Flyin Miata. We do know what we're talking about here. It's very, very challenging to get a single type of ECU working across a large number of almost identical Miatas. I think we got there with some of our products, but it took one tuner who had access to hundreds of cars and their data logs to get that drivability anywhere near stock. Aftermarket tunes, reflashes, like the sort of things you see on the NCs, the NDs, it's a little bit easier because those work by leaving most of the map alone. And then they modify just the parts that need to be modified for whatever you're trying to do. The new NC Turbo that we're working on, for example, we had the tuning done by an OE calibrator. Greg at Calibrated Performance. Calibrated Success, thank you guys. I knew it was Calibrated something. Yeah, Greg Banish at Calibrated Success did the tuning for that, and it drives like a factory car. It's amazing how good that tune is. And it is in large part because of his capabilities of a tuner and the attention to detail he paid to the extreme edges of the tuning map, but also because he had a very good place to start from instead of starting from scratch like you would with a stock ECU or something like a Mega Squirt or one of the aftermarket ECUs. So these cars do have an advantage. Their drivability tends to be better when tuned. Piggybacks are the same thing, such as our Voodoo box. It allows the car to use all of its factory programming when it is not in boost, but that's what this car here has. This thing is running on a Voodoo box. It's got one of our emissions legal stage 1 turbo kits on it. So it does return OBD2 codes. Well, it doesn't actually because it's 95, but if it was 96, it would. And it keeps all that stock drivability when you're off boost, and then under boost is the only time it modifies things. So I do recommend that unless you have a real need for a full programmable ECU, I do prefer reflashes or even piggybacks in many cases. If you're pushing the limits of power, you definitely need that aftermarket ECU for reliability because you need to be able to make the car think it was a factory turbo car from the factory. But depending on how far you're going, it may not be the best choice for you. It can be quite difficult to get them to start when it's cold outside because you only really get 1 or 2 tries at it every time you sit down to tune it. It's a challenge. Mike.
Oh boy.
Poor Mike. You folks are just...
It's a good one today.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
I do have a few questions of my own over here that I wrote down earlier.
It's a little all over, so why don't you move with one of your questions?
Let's see what questions I have. Yeah, these are ones that were put in before the video. Let's see what I've got here. So there's some questions in here about unsprung weight. And also, is it worth getting aftermarket wheels the same size as OE? Those are basically the same questions as far as I'm concerned. The aftermarket wheels are going to look different, but if you're getting the same size as OE, say if this car had come with 15x7s from the factory, which it actually did, well, maybe not this package, but some of them did, and you get a 15x7 of the same dimensions and the same offset, then the big difference is going to be the weight and the looks. So as long as your weight doesn't change too much, and I did a whole video on unsprung and rotating mass, if your weight didn't change too much, then go for it. Go for the look. If it's lighter, that's a bonus. Hard to get lighter than some factory wheels, honestly, some factory Miata wheels. If you're driving like a Chevy Citation, it's quite possible you could do better. But a Miata, they tend to have very light wheels. In that case, you're mostly looking at the look. If you do increase the weight quite a bit, it's not really a race car for the street kind of modification. It's mostly a visual modification, but that can have quite a bit of an effect on how your car feels in terms of the steer. You can get some weird steering behavior. You can get sort of heavy. Yeah, there's definitely some downsides. But just straight swapping out your wheels for the same dimensions doesn't have a big effect as long as basically the rough specifications are the same. Once you start playing with offset and wheel width, that's when we get into some of the effects that we talked about earlier with the tram lining, with the steering wheel kickback, and rubbing. I mean, that can happen too if you go with too negative on the offset. You start getting to the point where you have to start modifying body panels to make sure you don't rub. This thing's been modified enough it won't rub on 245s as long as you're running a 35mm offset on a 15x9. But these are not the original shape of these fenders, I'll tell you that. There's been quite a bit of work. You can't see it because of the stripes, but there's been quite a bit of work to open those up to make it fit. Okay, there's one question here about good alignment specs for spirited and daily driven Miatas. And this I would like to point you to the Flyin Miata knowledge base. We have an entire section of our website full of answers to technical questions, and we're always publishing new articles. We do have articles in there on how to align your Miata, or the alignment settings we recommend for Miata. So I would point you to that. Those are settings that we find work well for the street. They work well for performance driving. They work well for track day kind of driving. If you're trying to set up a race car for specific use, like this, you might run something different. But they're good all-around settings that you can be confident that you throw them in there, the car will work well, and you'll be pretty happy with it. What's that?
Comment in the link below.
There's a comment, there's a link in the comments below. Trying to mess me up there, Mike. Here's one question. How much boost would I recommend for a street car? On this one, I don't think it needs boost. It's got 500 horsepower already. Anyway. These ones, that one's not turbocharged. It doesn't need any boost. It needs all the boost, actually. It has none. The nice thing about power is you don't actually have to use it all. That's the thing. You can drive a 500 horsepower Miata using only 30 or 40 horsepower. I mean, as long as you have one of those throttle pedals that moves in the middle sections as well as just the bottom, it's fully drivable. You just don't want to compromise the drivability of the car from having too big a turbo. So it's not so much the boost level as the turbo size that you choose. We used to have in-house, we had a 96 Miata, 95 Miata, actually like this one, that had a turbo about that big, and made 400 horsepower on E85, and it was a huge amount of fun, but it did have some effect on the way the car drove, because the way those big turbos tend to spool, you've got some boost, everything's going well, and then all of a sudden you've got all the boost, and everything gets very exciting in a hurry, and you've got to know what you're doing before you jump in that car. That was not a car you just threw the keys to a beginner driver and say, here you go, have a good time driving around, because it did require a certain amount of respect. So does that one, the V8 track car, but it delivers its power in its torque in a very linear way, so it's a little bit, it requires less familiarization other than just sheer thrust. So there's really, I don't think there's such a thing as too much boost for a street car. I think there is a thing for an incorrect turbo size choice for your use. You got to depend on what you're trying to do with it in terms of what the turbo size you choose is. Anything else, Mike?
How much woe for your go in a street car?
How much woe for your go in a street car? I have done probably 9 videos on brakes by this point. There's a lot of stuff about brakes that you really can't be too big. You can't go too far on. This thing runs 11-inch rotors with 6 piston. It's got, what do we figure, 5 times as many brake pistons as it had when it came from the factory, because it's got 6 on each side on the front, and it's got 4 on each side in the back. It's got 20 brake pistons. It only came from the factory with 4. That hasn't really affected its streetability at all. The brake pads I choose to go in there do have a big effect. So again, did a whole video on brake pads. That's, again, it's like the turbo thing. It's not so much how much boost, it's how big is your turbo. In the case of brakes, it's not how big are your brakes, it's do you have the right pads in there? Because that's the thing that's going to make a difference on the street, because in the street, it's all about how do they stop from cold, and do they scream when they're doing it? And to some extent, how much crap do they throw on your wheels as part of a result? The third one is not a huge thing for me, but if you're driving a beautiful little street car like this with shiny wheels, that's definitely a factor in this particular creature. So make sure you've got the right pads. The nice thing about running things like Wilwood brakes is it's relatively easy to change the pads, so you can run a dual-purpose car by just simply slotting new pads in when you're at the track. When you put your track tires on, which is what I do with this one. When I take the track tires off, I put the street pads back in, along with the street tires, and there you go, I'm back on the street again. So you can't really have too much brake on a street car. It doesn't really affect you as long as you have the right pads that are on there. And proportioning has to be right as well. If you have a fixed proportioning front to rear, you may have to, or if you have an adjustable proportioning valve, you may have to adjust that for track tires versus street tires, because you'll have less weight transfer, blah, blah, blah. Basically, the less traction you have, the more rear bias you want to have, and that may end up with you have too much rear bias on the track, or you don't have enough rear bias on the street, too much front bias. So you might have to adjust that a little bit. But that's just a tuning issue, not a fundamental specification issue. Anything else, Mike?
What about?
He's going through a lot of questions. Thank you, everyone. I love the interaction on this one. I can't see Mike. There's Mike. Go back. I can see.
What about using Miatas for other kinds of things, like more than just getting groceries and stuff like that? Like, what if you wanted to do road trips or towing, small trailers or stuff like that? Do you have any input on
Using Miatas for other things such as road trips or towing small trailers or going to get groceries? I've been focusing on the grocery getting thing because it's the other side of this. I mean, that is about as far as you can get from a track car. Is I need to go on errands. I'm not choosing to drive a Miata because it's a Miata. I'm choosing to drive a Miata because it's the first car I grab the keys to. Road trips, you want comfort. I mean, yes, you can road trip. You can drive halfway across the country and something like this. You're going to feel it afterwards. You'll be happier if you're in a car that's not badly compromised, that rides well, it doesn't make you flinch every time you see an expansion joint coming. You'll enjoy yourself more. keep that in mind. So grocery getting is part of that. Road trips, I love taking road trips in Miata. I try to keep the interior as clean as possible of stuff. Just put everything in the trunk. You feel like you've just jumped in, you've gone for a 15-minute drive, but it's taking 2 days. That's fun stuff. It's a very enjoyable way. Miatas are good at it, even if they do rev high on the highway. You get someplace with twisty roads, you enjoy the twisty roads. I've been lucky enough to road trip all over Europe with friends in Miatas, all over the U.S. I've driven across Canada in Miatas. They're great little road trip cars, but again, make sure that you pay attention to the streetability in terms of make sure the suspension can move, make sure it's comfortable, make sure it uses a type of fuel that's available where you're going, tuning your rocket to run an E85, and then coming to, say, Grand Junction, Colorado, and finding there's no E85 gas stations around. That's a problem. So do make sure you do that. Again, that's a compromise you might make for power, but it might have effects in the real world. Towing trailers, I have no input on that. It can be done. I don't know anything about towing with Miatas. Not really my thing. I tend to put Miatas on trailers, not trailers behind Miatas. So can't help. But all the things that I'm talking about here in terms of race car for the street, that goes just, the longer you spend in the car, the more important that becomes. Whether it's regular day-to-day short duration trips like the grocery store, or just running up your favorite twisty road, going canyon carving for an evening, versus or whether it's a single long event such as going on a 2-week road trip. It's a lot of the same factors you need to take into account. Mike, anything else?
Yeah.
We will answer all these questions in the comments, so even if I don't get to them during this video, we will answer them later.
How about replacing engine mounts, trans mounts, diff mounts?
That's a good one.
Stuff.
What about replacing things like differential mounts and engine mounts and things with performance versions? You know, the Mazda competition of the IL Motorsports stiffer motor mounts, or some of the more extreme ones where you actually get to choose your durometer. What effect can that have? And that can have a big effect, because the buzzier the car is, again, that vibration will wear you down. And even on a day-to-day, you might find that, it's like, I just don't feel like that sort of drama today when I get in the car. I know I sound like an old man. I'm okay with that. I got to this point by being a young man first and then learning things. So yeah, you may find that on one drive, you might not get out of it and going, it was terrible. You might just find you're not as going towards the Miata as much. You're not going for as many fun drives on it as much, because there's just an overhead and dealing with the buzziness. So yeah, I actually, on my street car, one of my street cars, I changed out the motor mounts to some stiffer competition style motor mounts. And then about 2 weeks later, I took them out again, because I wasn't getting the benefit. The juice was not worth the squeeze. I wasn't getting the benefit I was looking for, and I was paying a price in terms of it was buzzy. And these weren't something I had actually paid a price for. These were something that I picked up off the shelves out here for evaluation, and it just didn't. It made it too buzzy. I didn't enjoy it. I have found, generally speaking, and talking to people, that if you drive with the top down, you're going to be more tolerant of that sort of thing than if you drive with the top up all the time. So if you're on a road trip with the top up, you might not enjoy the buzzy motor mounts as much as you do if you're running around with the top down on a canyon carving drive. So again, it depends on what you're looking to do. Mike. You guys are making me hoarse.
We're kind of all over the place at the moment.
We are all over the place. Yes, this is true.
You got anything else? Go ahead and jump on it, and I'll try to come
Yeah.
back to it.
Well, I'm going to wrap this up soon, because we've been going for nearly an hour. And I'm going to summarize the whole thing as make these decisions consciously. Be aware of the fact that what decisions you make, you are compromising a vehicle. And all vehicles are compromises from the factory. I mean, Mazda had to make a bunch of choices, this versus that, when they designed the car. Every time they come up with a new model year, they make choices this versus that. I mean, heck, they changed the steering rack on the 24, even though it's the same rack that's been around since 2017 in the RF. I bet you didn't know they changed it in 2017 on the RF versus the 2016. I mean, Mazda's always making these little choices. And it's the same sort of thing in a larger scale when we start modifying cars. We make choices to change the compromises the car has. Sometimes that compromise is just sheer money, such as the quality of the suspension that we choose. Sometimes it's, do we want stiffer motor mounts because we know it's going to cause more vibration, but we want that more direct feel. We want the shift to move less under shifting, that sort of thing. So just be aware of both sides of the compromise. There are very few modifications that are completely one-sided. There's some that are pretty darn close. Sway bar upgrades, for example, are pretty darn close. But not all of them are, and I do want everyone, when you make those choices, think about how it's going to affect how you use the car, not just on 2 track days a year, but when you're driving it to work every day, when you're taking it on fun roads, you're taking it up your canyon drives, you're taking it on dates, you're taking it on whatever, road trips across the country, just be conscious of what you're doing. Try not to go too far down one way if it means you can't use it another. So again, if you have more questions, throw them in the comments. We will address them in the future in the comments. It sounds like this one's going to be a fun comment section. I look forward to it. And if you do enjoy this sort of content, don't forget to subscribe, hit those like buttons, and we'll be back with more later. So again, my name's Keith Tanner from Flyin Miata. Thanks for your attention, and have a good time out there.